it looks like we are on the show here. Let's get our little opening credits out of the way. Welcome to Evolution Hour on the 24th of November, 2024. From the distant climes of Seattle, my relatives here. Whee! Okay, and there we go. As you can see, this is not my regular digs. I'm here with my relatives in Seattle. We're also starting a little early. Might as well launch the show tad bit, get that out of the way. And reminder, until I get back to Spokane, to be able to put all the cute little links into the video description. It'll be bare bones until we get around to that. So this one is not actually about the Bermuda Triangle, but it is about the Bermuda Triangle defense and how some creationists illustrate that. That was a concept that I worked out in quite a ways back. And we'll also be having material on the latest installment of Casey Luskin's Discovery Institute list of 800 plus junk DNA papers. Spoiler alert, it's still not helping them any. And I'll launch off with an opening bit about some source methods issues that came up as I was listening, driving here. I was listening to some NPR reports, and one happened to be an interview with a conservative evangelical pastor and his much more liberal daughter, and about how they were able to find some common ground and the like. And what was intriguing about it was that the report, yes, mentioned that the fellow is a conservative pastor and a Trump supporter, but so little information on fundamental issues that I had no way of pegging him as to where exactly on the landscape he was falling. Would he fall in the typical young earth creationist stance? And also, he instilled in his daughter the desire to do her own investigation and ground things in skeptical reason and all of that, which apparently the daughter was following through on. But that's, again, a dicey operation because you could find full-out creationists who would think that they're utilizing exactly that same method. And so the problem was, as usual with these kinds of programs, is that they're not probing onto the source field to find out what all of these phrases and notions mean in actual practice. Barely skirted around the edge of like gay marriage and abortion issues, which would be hot button items for anybody in that culture camp conservative evangelical frame that would be likely to support Trump. So this again is reminding us about an issue that I think we're really going to have to hammer away on, that other people are going to have to get on the bandwagon here, which is a source methods issue, is that it's not good enough merely to explore what people's views are and what common ground they do or do not have, which is perfectly legitimate, but also to look into the source field of what media are they relying on for their information, and if they really seriously do think they're fact-checking it, how do they go about doing that? Media are absolutely terrible at this. Doesn't matter whether they're left-wing, right-wing. One could argue that perhaps the right-wing media, the Fox Trump Pravdas and things like that, are even worse at it than you would find at CBS or NBC or NPR. But in terms of source methods, that asking for source data field, they're all shaking out the pretty much same end of the bag. And I think this is in part because this is not something that people do naturally. Source methods analysis is a very unusual burrowing beneath the surface mode of thinking that even people who kind of get into that on their own in the heat of debate and other contexts tend to jump right back to the data floor, if not philosophy level. Aaron Ra being an example of someone that operates in that level. So this is a long-term revision as to how media operates, how people who interact with the media operate, the standards by which people should be demanding that media follow through on, and also the need to have this operating with as many independent voices as possible, because the kind of homogenization and cartelization of media where too many outlets are owned by a relatively small number of groups. If you think about the Sinclair network, that's hyper-conservative, Murdoch-oriented material that operate in that Fox frame, that this is not good. And media, ABC is owned by the Disney company, for example, that it's too much channelization and play it safe and not necessarily boat rocking of stuff. And the stakes are getting way too high for us to be avoiding this issue. This is something that we're all going to have to be dealing with over the next few years as we navigate our way through the Trump 2.0 timeframe, which will be obviously referring to other matters on that. I'll just say, as a historian, I can't think of any administration in the history of the Republic that ever offered as incompetent and underqualified a slate of candidates as the Trump people have so far. It's basically the stuff he sees on Fox Trump Pravda. It's a superficial TV show version of cabinet. The most serious one that you could even see is somebody like Marco Rubio that's being proposed for Secretary of State. He at least has some chops. He's served on various committees in the Senate on foreign relations, so at least he has some connection to it. But the rest of them are just ludicrously incompetent. And of course, the crash and burn of Matt Gaetz just recently, although the replacement being proposed is not really any better. And for people for the education department, the people for commerce, and these various regulatory agencies, the anti-vaxxers, it's just an absolute mess. So we're going to be seeing how all of this shit will be hitting a great many fans over the next 4 years. And on the foreign policy front, frankly, the gear shift approach of suddenly veering away from previous commitments, I think in the long term is basically going to make the U.S. way less influential on the global field from now on, independent of who wins to be president. Because nobody that makes any really serious agreements with the United States can ever depend on that holding indefinitely. So it's only what we do, not what we say or agree to in terms of treaty obligations. And that's not a good thing overall. But anyway, that's stuff that we're going to be dealing with in the future. So where are we on our exciting Titans book as we're plowing through the rest of things? Their chapter on marine reptiles and pterosaurs is just a big rehash of YEC canon. They're not going through to tell us how many kinds there are or anything like that. So it's very unlike the dinosaur chapter. For all practical purposes, we've left their baraminology angle behind. And it's quite a lot of authority quoting. For example, there's an authority quoting on pterosaur and bat origins, like a 1999 paper from Serino, and as if that really bears on the state of the art for understanding systematics and paleontology in the 21st century. Who cares what Paul Serino was saying as an offhand remark, or the issues about bats? Bats and pterosaurs both have a thing in common. The earliest versions of them are very small and very difficult to fossilize. And so, except under unusual circumstances, you're just getting a little scattershot of groupings in this area. So that's where we bring in the Bermuda Triangle defense. In the old tip material that you can see at that website that I keep on blurbing at the beginning of every show, one of the chapters delineated the idea of the Bermuda Triangle defense. And it was related largely to the Duane Gish approach to creationism, which would be to say, oh, the mysterious origins, we don't know, there's this big hole in the fossil record. And without ever explaining the context or the reasons why there might be a gap in the fossil record. What's the geology? What's the taphonomy? What's all of those little fiddly bits? And that's when I came up with the analogy of the Bermuda Triangle. It would be as if one were trying to talk about the mysterious disappearance of a ship and forgetting to mention that the worst hurricane in 20 years went through the area on the night the ship mysteriously disappeared. Think that might have had something to do with it? So what it means is the leaving out of relevant background context that would put the claim into perspective. And it applies to the Bermuda Triangle, it applies to creationism, it applies to a whole bunch of other areas where it's the cherry picking the little teeny bliplet of information. And you'll find that that's a not uncommon problem with ideologues of all stripes, including creationists. The part two of the show, of course, relates to dear old Casey Luskin's 800 list. And 5 of them related to nucleosomes, which are the unit of the chromatins that are composed of DNA wrapped around histones. And a surprisingly large number of them are quite old research. The vast majority of the citations that are in the 800 list are relatively recent, as in since 2020. They're trying to trawl the technical literature to look terribly impressive and up to date. So it's almost suspiciously interesting when suddenly we're getting really old material. So there's a paper from 2007 by Black on the conformation of these little molecules, and then one from 2008 by Sela et al., suggesting a role for the abundant ALUs as, quote, structural punctuation marks, unquote, in the organization of chromatin. And then one from 2011 by Betikin, which is also on the structure of all this stuff. So we're going to be dangling in, when I get back to Spokane, putting the references in. There's newer material that's of relevance. The one paper that they deal with newer is Rosenberg 2018 on how RBPJ binds to methylated sequences and thus to methylated ALUs. And then there's an even more a recent paper from Wang 2022 noting how they were enriched in ALUs, which is hardly a news bulletin, while discussing all the little harmful aspects and how the nucleosome arrangements might be a way of compensating. So what we are on here is that this little particular issue of this RBPJ thing, the Discovery Institute list is clearly not pressing on to this newer work. Instead, they're kind of dropping it like a hot potato. Whether or not Casey Luskin was aware of the fact that there's this theodicy problem, if he had tried to pursue this much earlier, is another matter. But it reinforces the point that the arguments being made in that bibliography, unannotated, is just trying to overwhelm us by sheer volume, rather than to try to put forward a cogent explanation of anything and to explore any of the data field. And of course, it's extremely relevant that none of this stuff is being done by anybody in the anti-evolution community. So they're just cherry picking material from the sidelines. It certainly adds nothing to the newer issue of whether or not most ALUs actually are functional and therefore fit the paradigm that Casey Luskin was attempting to do, which is he was aiming for 50%-ish would work. None of these papers continue in that line of indicating that any more than just a tiny fraction of ALUs can be determined to be involved in processes, and in part because of their very presence. They're just material that pops into the genome, and therefore the genome systems have to take it into account in order to edit stuff out and keep them from being a nuisance. And so you have a bunch of quality control mechanisms that relate to it, and the fact that the ALUs are kind of tags that can be easily accessed, as we noted in previous episodes. So it's a fascinating issue, absolutely delightful matter to figure out how the kind of dynamics are going on in this seething mass of cellular biosystems that are going on constantly inside of individual organisms, and then collectively in all the varying variations of that in a population and in the larger scheme of life, and so forth and so on. The idea that little bits and pieces of this are going to act as the grist for either things glitching up or once in a while actually being beneficial, as the brain examples were in previous discussions. None of that's terribly surprising, and none of it is supporting the intelligent design argument. So this is a truncated show. I don't see anybody in our chat overlay, probably because we started a little bit early. And of course, we're getting into the holiday period. And so it's entirely probable that people will be just catching these as catch can. But anyway, that will put forward the basic gist of the thing. We'll be doing next week. If we'll either be back in Spokane or not, you'll find out by looking at the back of the room. But there'll be more on that marine predation issue and some new stuff on Ken Ham. And then, of course, the week after that, we'll have some more Casey Luskin material. It's obviously to plow through all of those. We're about 70 sources or so into it, so about 10% of the way into all of that material, because if there's particular authors or topics, I'll be picking up examples of that may be falling later in their listing. I think it's exceedingly unlikely there's going to be any further smoking guns beyond that one lowly little paper that sort of half-assed supported the contention only that Luskin and company are offering, on only because it wasn't terribly detailed in explaining what the situation was. So they're batting 1,000 as in nothing so far. And that confirms the material that Dan Stern-Cardinale and others have noted about the actual incidence of functionality in retrotransposons and these various interspersed elements in the genome. So anyway, let me put up our little advert, or our patrons, without whom it would be much more difficult to pull this little trick off. And bear in mind, everybody, that in the years to come, if my suspicions are right about the impact of the Trump administration's economic policies, it's going to be a bumpy time ahead. And so even though it would be not helping my bottom line, if any of you who are patrons for the project find yourself in dire economic straits to where you can't shell out some scratch for this channel, well, you have to take care of your own house first. But at any rate, all of you who are sticking with me, I thank you very, 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 very much on that. And Jackson and I are busy beavers in working on the material for the Volume 2 Rocks Were There, which I would be pointing over my shoulder to act as a plug on that point. I think it's going to be just a juicy amount of useful material that's going to be informative and a further contribution to the field, just as Volume 1 was, because so much of the stuff on the direct flood legends and the imaginary paleo worlds that pop around inside the creationist imagination, and a lot of the systematics issues and a lot of the culture camp issues in relation to claims about Darwinian racism and the role Darwin supposedly played on the Nazis, all of that stuff is going to be popping up in the discussion in Book 2, as well as Us, Human Origins, which is such a deliciously massive field to try to run to ground. There'll be an awful lot of technical material that we'll be putting forward on that, on the various systematics and the dynamics of the early origin of the species and spread, and the spread of Homo erectus around the world, and all of this stuff, and the cognitive literature on the development of language and mind and all of that, which is still a burgeoning field that we're just getting into, and which creationists overall are just 900 miles away from. So let me conclude by putting up our advert to Rocks Were There. And then and away we go. And of course, on the finished links, there's links to all the books and the Patreon and all of that stuff. There's been kind of an exodus out of Twitter over the last week or so. I've had an account on Blue Sky, and I've been kind of upgrading that to pay more attention to the content over there, as a lot of the scientific minds and the like, and free thinkers and various people are getting much more bold over in the Blue Sky environment. So I'm over there, same moniker as I have over on Twitter, which I will never call X. And so everybody hunker down, be careful, be safe. We're way past worrying about gun-toting killer penguins. We're going to have Trump administration 2.0 to contend with. And it's going to be a dark path. And it would have been nicer if we had taken the easy way and had Harris win the 2024 election. But nope, I guess we're going to have to do it the hard way. And you're going to find an awful lot of Trumpistas who are going to be facing the fact that their golden-plated calf is not able to pull off all the miracles that he's been promising, and in fact is going to be screwing them royally on a rather serious scale. And just how serious it is, we're going to see just what the impact will be from tariffs and immigration expulsions and a lot of these other blunderings that are going on, the codification of that tax cuts for the wealthy and all of that. That's all going to be hitting simultaneously. Boy, we're moving past Benjamin Harrison level bad economic policies here. So anyway, everybody stay safe, stay healthy. Certainly in the new administration, you won't be wanting to listen to Robert Kennedy Jr. or these other people who are being stuck in or are being offered for positions of authority on national institutes of health and all that. Here in Washington State, we're going to be proceeding reasonably no matter what the hell goes on in D.C. A lot of money and time and intellectual capital will be squandered over the next 4 years. But we're a resilient nation, and most of us are not Trumpistas. So let's keep our powder dry and proceed through and take a look at a better future in the years to come. So everybody stay safe. See you all next week, and keep plugging away at it, because the universe is far too interesting and too much neat material is available on these things these days for us to throw the towel in and let the barbarians screw everything up. Now, we have too interesting of a future to build to let them pull that little trick off. So anyway,